And as always, I look forward to speaking with my next guest. You probably know his work. If not, you should. Professor Richard Wolff is Professor of Economics Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. He's also visiting professor at the graduate program in International Affairs of the New School University in New York. He is also the host of the program Economic Update, which can be seen Tuesday evenings on Free Speech TV, and he is the founder of democracyatwork.info, which has a lot of information that might be useful to you and enlightening to you as well. So without any further ado, Richard Wolff, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you very much, Richard. Glad to be here.
Well, here's something that's been on my mind, and I wanted to talk to you about it. There is, as you well know, because it's been discussed a lot in left circles, there's a concept, but our audience may not know, a concept called primitive accumulation. And basically, the way it's been interpreted, I think most aptly, but you tell me, is that in the days before capitalism, somehow some people got a lot more resources than other people, and they did it in a pre-capitalist way by just taking it, essentially, by grabbing it, by seizing it. And there have been examples throughout history where this has happened even more recently, the enclosure movement in England and Wales, for example, where common lands were just taken and enclosed, and the people, the villagers who had used them for centuries were suddenly discovered it was private property and they had no access to it anymore. So there's this concept of basically that people use power and political influence and other forces to take what should be the commonly held and then somehow rewrite history as if nature decreed it to be that way. And I don't know if you consider that a good description of primitive accumulation, but it's the best I could come up with. But what I really wanted to talk to you about, Richard Wolff, seems to me that in the wake of the pandemic and this economic crisis, that we're seeing a kind of new resurgence of what I would think of as primitive accumulation. But I want to know your thoughts on both, whether I got it, the concept right, and whether we are in fact seeing something like it recurring now.
Yeah, I think you got it basically right. I would say it a little bit differently, but the point is basically the same, that there are periods of time when you might say we have normal accumulation. A company does reasonably well and takes a portion of its profits, plows them back into the business, and the business grows. And that Marx himself, who's the father of a lot of these ideas, called that, general accumulation or capitalist accumulation. But he wanted to distinguish it from another way that money grows in the hands of people, not by the normal process of producing something, getting a profit, and plowing it back in, but, as you put it, basically seizing it, in which one part of the population gets into the position, one way or another, to basically grab the property of other people and grow their wealth, grow their businesses by that kind of a seizure. Sometimes legalized if you can get the laws adjusted, other times basically illegal. And it is going on now, and it is a useful concept. Let me explain. If you suddenly drive 30 million people out of work, which is what the last 3 weeks or 4 weeks in the United States have meant, if you make it impossible for 30 million people to go to work, you are in the process of destroying many of the businesses that those people used to work for. This is a simple reality. Profit depends on labor. If what you have is a factory or an office or a store, or you have equipment or things like that, they will not produce you a profit. They will sit there gathering rust and dust, and that's it. The only way to make a profit is to have a laborer or more than one working there, paying them less than what they add by their production to whatever it is you have to sell. Absent the worker, the profit disappears. But you need, if you're a business, to earn profit to cover all of your fixed costs. You still have to pay insurance for your business. You still have to pay taxes on the land you occupy. There's a whole set of expenses of business that are paid for out of profit. If the workers can't work and therefore you don't earn the profit, you can't pay off the loans you took out, the taxes you owe, the fixed costs you have to cover. Bottom line, many, many businesses that didn't accumulate enough protective cash, which is most businesses, are now in a position that literally they're going to go out of business. If not this week, next week. They can't survive. They are going to go belly up. They are therefore going to be desperate to dissolve their businesses with the least long-term damage. And in swoop the big corporations, taking their business from them, basically wiping them out and coming in and buying whatever assets are left on the cheap. I mean, think of it in very simple terms. Hundreds of mom and pop restaurants can't survive this closure. So we're going to get an explosion of expansion of the big chains who are going to come in and take advantage, literally taking over the space that was once occupied by a local restaurant. Many of those kinds of tendencies that were moving slowly in the normal capitalist expansion competition way will now be done with real speed. To see it from the other side, there are companies that are doing extraordinarily well, making profits off of the pandemic. Amazon is one, and there are many others. Amazon, led by Jeffrey Bezos, richest man in America, I believe his assets were in the neighborhood of 130 billion. If, as the reports are true, he's made another 25 billion. Look at what we're seeing. 30 million people whose economic situation is being crushed at the same time that the richest man in the country becomes markedly richer. I mean, this is craziness, but it will enable the Amazon Corporation, and there are many others like them, to have an enormous store of cash at the same moment that desperate middle and small businesses will be going out of business and having to sell to these folks with cash at fire sale prices whatever is left of their businesses. Last point. The $6+ trillion that the Federal Reserve has decided to pour, because it's in a panic mode, into the economy, they've decided to go particularly to use that money to buy corporate bonds. The 2,000 biggest corporations in America, therefore, just got an enormous infusion of money. They wrote up bonds, they issued bonds, sold them to the Federal Reserve for real money, and so they now sit in a position to take advantage of the destroyed economy around them to buy up every asset they think might add to their profits. This is government enabling a concentration of wealth that we will see, but will be greater and in a shorter period of time than anything normal capitalism would allow. And so I think your notion of a kind of primitive accumulation is right on the money.
Well, and I guess a follow-up question to this, and you said it, but I want to explore it a little bit more, is that not only is this not a product of some natural law of economics, that this is very much, but rather it is very much the product of government policy and government choices. It doesn't have to be this way. I mean, so for example, the government chooses not to ensure that everybody in the country is able to have a minimum amount of income no matter what, get $2,000 to everybody in America. I mean, there are a number of ways to do it. Replace the wages of people who lose their jobs or have to stay home. That's one conscious decision. The decision you mentioned, everybody talks about the $500 billion that the original first bailout bill sent out. But the real money, as you point out, is in the Federal Reserve giving away $6.5 trillion. It's not an act of God that's going to corporations and not to working people. I mean, we could go down the list, but one of the reasons I mentioned the enclosure movement of the 18th century is that these wealthy lords and ladies or whatever they call themselves got Parliament to do their bidding because they had a government in service of the wealthy and powerful. My point would be our government is also in service of the wealthy and powerful. That's why Jeff Bezos got another $25 billion out of this pandemic. That's why middle-sized businesses and small businesses are being swept away in a tsunami while corporations are being rescued. So I would argue that all of this suggests not only that we're in an era of primitive accumulation, but that there's kind of brute force at work here on behalf of the wealthy and powerful that is not just passively, but actively through government, crushing small businesses and crushing workers, letting them drown. But maybe I'm overstating the case. I don't know. Am I?
No, if anything, this may surprise you, Richard, but if anything, you're understating it. Let me give you the example that, at least for me, brings it all home in the starkest way. 2 days ago, or maybe now 3 days ago, President Trump said that he would use an obscure law to order the meatpacking workers, the people who work in the slaughterhouses and so on, that prepare the chicken and the beef and the pork and the lamb, etc., for the grocery store shelf. He's going to order them, and there are, I don't know, 10, 20,000 of them, maybe more, to go back to work. I found this stupefying. He's ordering them to go back to work. It's important to understand what he did not order. He did not order their employers to make those workplaces safe. The reason the meat packing plants were shut down was that there was a conflagration of thousands of people catching the virus, becoming sick. Hundreds of people had already died who were meat packing workers. Governors in several states, etc., ordered the plants shut down because they are unsafe. So the first amazing thing is that the president orders people back. But I could live with that if he had ordered the employers to do what they should have done anyway, but did not, namely to make the workplace safe. There should be testing every day of every worker to separate out those that are sick and get them the treatment they need, and to assure those that are not sick that they will not be infected. That's an enormous operation. You have to reconfigure the slaughterhouse so that everybody is 6 feet away from the next person for all the reasons we know. Everybody has to have a real quality mask and real quality gloves, and there has to be disinfecting all the time and cleaning all the time. The employers, in this case the meat packers, they didn't want to spend the money because they're a business of profit, and it's going to hurt profit to spend all that money testing and disinfecting and all the rest. And the president allowed them to continue to not make safe and then order the workers to go in to an unsafe workplace. This is as violent, maybe even more violent an abuse of the working class than in the enclosures when you deprive them of access to the common lands, et cetera, because you are literally saying to workers, we're going to threaten you. If you don't come back to work when we order you, either the employer will fire you, in which case you're not eligible for unemployment anymore, or we will arrest you for violating this law that the president has called out. So you face monetary loss, possible loss of your freedom, or you can go to work risking the infection of yourself and all the people closest to you. Any economic system that confronted the mass of its people, working class, with a choice like that could not possibly hang on to the loyalty of those people. Capitalism is in the process of destroying itself, and there is no nice way to pretend otherwise.
Again, we're talking with economist Richard Wolff. And, one of the things that strikes me, this is yet another example. One of the things that I think the pandemic has highlighted, as if an ultra bright spotlight had been flashed on somebody, like most of our listeners won't know this reference, like John Garfield being interrogated and the light goes in his face, is like, you did it, didn't you, Lefty? One of the things that is being revealed to me, and I think hopefully to the world, about capitalism as an ideology and as a way of life in this pandemic, is that it is literally murderous. That it's absolutely clear by the actions of Donald Trump and other Republicans, by the actions, and some Democrats too, by the actions of Boris Johnson in Great Britain and so on, that and certainly by the statements of CEOs, that they're very clear. So it's Lieutenant Governor of Texas and so on, very clear. No, we want people to die in order to make sure that our profits continue. They're being very open about it when they talk about herd immunity and that sort of thing. The situation you just described with that obscure law is saying we will have these businesses open and we are willing to kill workers. Professor Wolff, I have this this little mental test I go through as I listen to things like that, which is, what if Hugo Chavez had done it? What if, Hugo Chavez had said, I'm going to make my workers go back to work, the former president of Venezuela, I'm going to make my workers go back to work, and a bunch of them are going to die, and I don't care. We'd be talking night and day about the brutality of Venezuelan socialism. Look at all the empty shelves in all our stores. Look at all the empty streets because people can't work. If this were the product of communism or socialism, we would be talking about the insane brutality of that system. And yet, I would argue that this level of brutality and savagery is almost impossible for the human mind to comprehend, that we could have a president who openly advocates, eventually he gave in, but he's advocating it again, opening up the country for reasons of profit, even though people will die. We have governors doing the same thing. We have a prime minister of Great Britain doing the same thing. We have CEOs saying, yeah, some people openly, some people are going to die, but we got to go back to work, meaning we got to go back to making profits. I would argue that capitalism is not only an ideology, I think we're learning that it is a deadly ideology. Am I overstating or understating?
No, I would only add, so that everybody gets it clear, that I am not arguing, nor do I think you are, that we don't need a functioning economy. Of course we do. We need people working. We need goods and services to be produced. That's a very important thing. And we could have it. Yes, it's a big job, but we're confronted with a big crisis, and we're the richest country in the world, proud that we do things better than others, and we're not even getting up to mediocre level in handling this. We have to face the reality. The capitalist system didn't prepare adequately in this country for another virus of the sort we have seen many times in the past. We know that the problem is infecting people, spreading it. We know we have to keep people apart, that we need masks and gloves and ICU units in hospitals with adequate beds and ventilators. We know all of that. We could have produced it, But we didn't because it wasn't profitable for private enterprises to produce and stockpile all the things necessary. We knew what was necessary, but our system isn't in the business of producing what's necessary. It's in the business of producing what's profitable. In that circumstance, a conscious government could have come in and said honestly, okay, capitalism focused on profit didn't produce what we need to deal with a dangerous virus. So we, the government, are going to do it. We will make it profitable for the producers of masks and tests and all the rest to do what has to be done because we'll buy it at a nice price so they'll make it profitable. The government would therefore be compensating for the failure of profit-driven capitalism to do what the society needs. But our government, captured by capitalist ideology, can't think like that, cannot admit publicly that capitalism failed to do on the basis of profit what we need done. You know, the perfect way to understand it is to compare it to defense. It is not profitable for companies to produce guns and bullets and rifles and tanks and missiles and all the rest and put them in a storehouse, waiting for when the government might have a war it needs those things for. So the way we handle that is the government comes in, buys the guns and missiles and ships and tanks and planes as fast as the private capitalist can produce them and pays a price that gives those military industrial complex enterprises a nice fat profit. That's how we handle what apparently strikes our leaders as important, hardware. But it didn't strike them as something they could dare say about our medical needs. And so here we are with a failed capitalism that did not do what it should have done to prepare because it was focused on profit. But here's the worst part. We've now been in a pandemic for a month or more. They still aren't doing it. We have tested less than 1% of the people in this country. We don't even know where the diseases are. We don't have the tests to do it better. We don't have them distributed properly in the country, nor the gloves, nor the ventilators, nor anything else. This is an unspeakable failure, again, because the private sector doesn't want to negatively impact its profits by taking care of making workplaces safe. Nor should anyone be surprised by this. The reason we have an Occupational Safety and Health Administration, OSHA, in this country is because capitalists have never paid for, as they should have, making their workplaces safe. You remember Upton Sinclair a century ago writing novels about, by the way, the meatpacking industry, among others, in which he showed the unspeakable conditions that capitalists then were putting workers into. But they didn't then order them to go to work. They just gave them the choice, work under these awful conditions or have no job at all, which in effect is where we are coming back to now. It is unspeakable. We could have a much more functioning economy if we had cleaned up and made safe the workplaces. We aren't doing it now. We haven't done it. We didn't prepare for it. And these are all complete failures of a system. And I think the majority of the American people slowly, hesitantly, because it's hard to see, are nonetheless coming to terms with the fact that they're living in an economic system whose time to go has come.
You know, Richard Wolff, first of all, a very clear explanation, and thank you for that. And secondly, all of it touches on something that I want to make sure our listeners and viewers understand, which is, but I want your thoughts on it, which is the distinction that gets blurred, I think, in the public mind and in a lot of Democrats' minds, frankly, between the functioning of an economic system that includes a large element of profit, private corporations taking profit. under the kinds of circumstances you described, where the government plans the economy, makes sure certain needs are met, even when there's no profit in it, may sometimes contract with private corporations to do so, and so on. So I think people confuse the idea of a functioning economy that includes some measure of private sector activity with capitalism as an ideology, meaning the sort of making sacred the idea that everything has to happen because a capitalist, wants to make a profit off it, and that if we turn everything over to the private sector, things will be wonderful. We sort of got partly out of it during maybe during the 1930s in this country, through the 60s, 70s, Reagan era started to undo all of that. But capitalism as an ideology, which is what we're seeing now, ruling our political class, means, to me at least, that we don't plan for a pandemic in exactly the way you described, because if it were worthwhile, some corporation would already be doing it. And I think people are beginning to understand that you can't run your society or your economy that way, because, for example, 3,000 people died on 9/11, and we spent trillions in unnecessary wars. Far more than that have probably already died in this country because of the coronavirus, and we're still not doing much about it. And that, to me, means the ideology of capitalism, as opposed to the functioning of an economy, something that describes the mechanics of an economy. The ideology of capitalism is the problem. But what do you think of my distinction between capitalism as an ideology and tools that describe how an economy works?
I like it. I think it conforms to an old idea, which I also like, which says that the system in which you live requires, if it is going to survive, that you think in certain ways. I mean, let me use the example that'll make it starker. For a long time, in many parts of the world, the economic system was slavery. That meant that a small number of people were masters and a large number of people were slaves. That system could not survive unless, for example, you couldn't survive by violence. You couldn't have a small number of masters forever violently repressing a large number of slaves. Sooner or later, they'd lose. So they understood that, and they needed to persuade slaves, whether it was through ministers of the church, or whether it was through schooling, or whether it was through intimidation, and all of them were used. They had to convince slaves that they either couldn't manage society by themselves, that they needed a master, the same way we convinced masses of people over the years of monarchy that we needed a king. But at a certain point, the slaves broke out of the ideology that kept slavery going and said, this system is no good for us. Just like we came after centuries of kings to say, we don't want kings anymore. We're not going to be their subjects. We're not going to be held and controlled by somebody who's only the leader because he was the son of the previous leader. That's not an acceptable arrangement, et cetera, et cetera. Well, the same applies here. You're right. Capitalism needs a set of ideas to keep it going. The minute people break from those ideas, the system is in trouble. And here's the irony. Sooner or later, it's the systems themselves that work so badly that they undermine the confidence of the people that life has to be organized that way. And when that happens, the system is over. That's what's happening, I think, right now, that people are realizing, wait a minute, if you have 30 million people unemployed, why are they sitting there doing nothing? We're paying them something with unemployment. Why aren't we using them in a productive way? They'd rather be working themselves. Why isn't the government doing, for example, what it did in the 1930s? Let the government come in and hire millions of people. That's what it did in the 1930s. So I'm not advocating something that has never been done or comes from the moon or is some evil communist plot. I'm describing something we did the last time we had terrible unemployment. And those people were hired by the government and did wonderful socially useful things. The WPA with its art activity across the country, the building of many of those beautiful national parks in the western part of America that everybody still visits with awe at their beauty, etc. We could be doing wonderful benefits for our country while giving work to people who want it rather than having unemployment. The only reason we allow there to be such a thing as unemployment is that the private capitalists don't like it. If they fire people and the government hires them, they can see what kind of feeling that is going to produce in people. They're not going to be happy with the private who fires them, and they're going to be much happier with the government that hires them. So the privates come in and block it. Yeah, but that confronts people with the most stark example imaginable of capitalism's irrationality.
Well, Richard Wolff, if you have time for one more thought based on that,
Please,
I would
shoot.
say this. I would say this. You mentioned slavery, and until for most of human history, for thousands of years, human beings kept other human beings in slavery. So much so that one of the main defenses of slavery in this country and in Europe in the 19th century was, well, it's just a part of life. Someone even wrote that. It's just a fact of life that human beings keep others as slaves. It's always been that way. Aristotle talked about it. St. Augustine. So throughout human history, we've kept slaves. It's naive to think that we won't continue to keep slaves in the future. Now, because it's just the way the world works. That was the argument. And yet slavery, for the most part, direct and overt slavery ended in most parts of the country. Of the world. It still exists in certain places, but by and large, it's commonly accepted now. Slavery is wrong. Don't keep others as slaves. Well, there are other forms of limits on human freedom. You mentioned one, because the government doesn't guarantee every working person a job. People have to put up with abusive working conditions, and employers are able to mistreat workers in ways that they wouldn't if people could leave and get a government job and so on. So there are a number of ways. We've talked about wage slavery before as a concept that used to be well known in this country and perhaps should be again. The idea that you're forced to work for wages and not reap the benefits of your own work and so on. My optimistic thought, based on everything we're going through, tragic as it is, and reinforced by what you said, is that perhaps, just perhaps, we can come to recognize that what people now say is a fact. Well, it's always going to be that way. We're always going to have capitalists exploiting other people. We're always going to have a profit-taking class, an investor class exploiting others. Maybe, just maybe, people will wake up to the idea, as they did with slavery, that no, it doesn't have to be this way just because it's been this way for a long time. So I'll let you have a.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I like to use the example of monarchy. We used to have a series of kings who had all the power, including life and death, over the mass of people who were their quote unquote subjects. And often those kings said that they spoke to God, that they were kind of the intermediate between God in the heaven and people here on earth. And so we should all bow down to the king as the representative, if you like, of God himself, herself, or however you conceive of God. So people were really cowed by that. You had to do what the king said, because if you didn't, you were not obeying God himself, et cetera, et cetera. So, everything has been tried to get people to believe that the way things are, A, have been always that way, and B, always will be that way. That's a way of telling people there's no point in imagining some fantasy of being otherwise. In short, it's a conservative mentality. Nobody knows what is or isn't possible in the future. So stop pretending. I don't know it will be different, but you don't know that it won't be. And so there we are with our lack of knowing. So let's see what we're each going to do. you're not going to do anything because you reassure yourself that it's always been this way and it always must be. We'll always have to have a boss in the workplace. Well, here's my final thought. We got rid of kings in the political world. We said, nope, you're not going to make the decision. Everybody is going to have an equal vote. We're all going to make the big decisions, peace and war and all the rest of it, not by having some king tell us what to do and excluding us from the decision. No, we're going to make the decision. Very powerful, very dramatic, and we don't have many kings left in the world, and those that exist are mostly figureheads. But here's the irony. We got rid of the king in politics, but we kept them in capitalist economics. Inside each enterprise, we got a king. The owner, the major shareholders, the board of directors, they act like kings. They tell the vast majority of people in every workplace, the workers, they tell them when to show up, where to sit, what machine to use, how to use it, and when we're all done with the work, they get the fruits of our labor. What we've poured our brains and muscles into producing belongs in the instant that we produce it to somebody else, namely the employers. We have kingdoms inside every enterprise. We didn't get rid of kings, we just moved them. And that's a product of an ideology that says we have to have a boss. No, you don't. We got rid of the bosses in politics, and we long ago should have gotten rid of the remaining boss who thinks and functions like a king inside an enterprise. If we believe in democracy, it ought to have been in the workplace from the beginning. And believe me, if workers were in charge now, democratically, they would be insisting that the workplace is safe because it's them. It's not some employer who focuses on profits, who basically doesn't care, especially now, if the workplace is safe. So the workers are forced back. A few get sick, a few die. With 30 million people unemployed, there's lots more people looking to get that job. It's not nice for me to say, but I'm only saying the ugly reality that we are actually being confronted with. If we had a collective, democratized enterprises, then the workplace would be safe because the workers would not allow it to be otherwise. And they would make sure that we're prepared for viruses or bacteria or bad weather or anything else because it's them and they are the majority. And they wouldn't give a few people billions of dollars in wealth while everybody else is struggling to put their kid through college. I mean, we need to change this system so it doesn't give us these ugly specters of our own abuse.
Well, ugly specters of our own abuse, that's quite a phrase. And unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I do have to say that this image of bosses as kings, this analogy to me is perfect and so important. And I'm going to reflect on that and think about that more. But Professor Richard Wolff, a host of Economic Update on Free Speech TV, and founder of democracyatwork.info and so much more. As always, great to talk to you. And as always, thank you for coming on the program.
My pleasure, Richard, and I look forward to our next continuing of this conversation.